I've been asked to comment on the significance of the current reform process and also look a bit at the risks or the challenges that we face. And that's a fairly big topic, so I'm just going to jump straight into it. I don't think there's anybody here today, because you wouldn't have been here if you didn't realize that something real, something significant is going on in Myanmar. And I just wanted to maybe start by just giving a little bit more of a flavor to what that is. Basically, in just 2 years since the start of reform in early 2011, we have seen the democratic opposition being released, moving from prison into parliament. More than 40 members of the National League for Democracy, including, of course, its leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, has been elected to parliament and are there now. Ethnic armed groups, which have been fighting the government from their jungle strongholds for decades, in some cases more than half a century, are now having their photos taken with government officials in Naypyidaw, which is the new capital of Myanmar, to commemorate new ceasefires. A government commission has been set up, chaired by opposition leader Aung San Suu Kyi, to investigate police violence. Just imagine that. And a joint commission, or a committee I think is the correct term, has been set up with government officials and former political prisoners to look into the cases of the remaining possible political prisoners. Private newspapers are publishing real news, honest criticism of the government, and government ministers are speaking openly, very openly in fact, about poverty, about corruption, about human rights, and they are seeking advice and assistance both from their own civil society and from the international community. This is something that did not happen until a couple of years ago. So if I can just quote Tom Malinowski from Human Rights Watch, a government that has long treated its people as enemies is beginning to treat them as citizens. A regime that has thumbed its nose at the world is now extending a hand for assistance and advice. Now, clearly a lot remains to be done. Myanmar certainly is not a democracy yet. Indeed, constitutionally, it still contains many elements of military rule, and Tatmadaw is right there. Whatever is going on in Myanmar, they're right there. They haven't gone away, the Tatmadaw being the Burmese word or the Myanmar word for the military. Although we do have now ceasefires with 10 out of 11 major insurgent groups, which hold out, I think, a real promise for peace, maybe for the first time in Myanmar modern history. We do have a brutal war continuing in Kachin State, and unfortunately, as part of that war, army personnel continue to violate human rights in many serious ways, as they have done for a long time. We have seen communal violence in northern Rakhine states, which unfortunately has brought to the surface a deeply racist element of Burman Buddhist culture. And despite the major economic reforms that we are seeing, millions of deeply impoverished households have yet to see any material benefits from the new system. Now, I do have to mention those limitations. We'll be talking about them a lot more, but I do want to point out that, to me at least, the all-important story nonetheless is about positive change. Myanmar is already a very different place than it was under the military regime, both politically and economically. Indeed, everyone in the country, and this includes top government officials that were part of the previous regime, make a clear distinction between the old and the new system. And contrary to some skeptics, I understand why there might be some of those around, I'm personally at least absolutely confident in saying that for leaders like President Thein Sein and also Speaker of the lower house, Sui Man, who are driving the reforms from the top, this is not about protecting military power and privileges. It is very much about genuine regime change. The new government is not consolidating military rule. It is at least slowly beginning to unravel it. Now, we need to be aware of the limitations, of course. We need to continue to work to address them. But to complain, as some still do, that Myanmar is not yet a democracy, as some parts of the state continue to violate human rights, is really just to state the obvious. Military dictatorships do not turn into democracies overnight. That kind of change takes decades, if not generations. At this early stage, and it is very much at the early stage, the important markers are the direction of change, and it's the commitment to change. And neither of those is, in my assessment at least, in doubt at this point. So for those who ask, are the changes genuine? Yes, absolutely. I'm confident that they are. There is a real intent to bring about major progressive reforms in governance structures as well as in the broader political and economic environment. And that I'm also convinced that we are only at the beginning. How momentous the changes have been so far, they are still just the beginning of what is going to come if the current process survives. Are they irreversible is another question that people ask a lot. And my answer to that is no. How can they be? Transitions are always highly uncertain. My point, however, would be that this should not be a source of criticism, but rather just a reminder to everyone that we really need to buckle down and get on with trying to consolidate these changes as best as we can. Looking ahead a bit, the reforms at this point have gathered significant momentum, and each success that the current government is making it harder and harder for potential spoilers to, if you will, turn the tide. The key to this has been the willingness by moderates on all sides, in all groups, in the otherwise highly hostile Myanmar political environment, to put those differences aside and actually work together for what I think we should call the good of the country, even that might sound a bit like a sort of an empty statement. There's a lot of goodwill in all groups in Myanmar at this point. President Thein Sein clearly has been a critical catalyst of this, although he was also a senior member of the old regime. He has put aside the military's traditional obsession with security, and he has reached out to former enemies to make them partners in this quest for peace and prosperity. Speaker of the lower house, as I also mentioned earlier, Swim An, he's another former general. He has actually proven to be quite an effective coalition builder. And he too has been reaching out. He's taken on board policy suggestions from the opposition within the parliament that he sort of leads, and has actually been willing to push through some of those suggestions rather than just push through the narrow agenda of his own party. Aung San Suu Kyi, of course, has also reached out to build bonds with her former jailers. Indeed, she has done this to such an extent that a lot of her former supporters are now getting a little bit worried about what she's doing and is criticizing her for not challenging the government sufficiently, especially on issues of human rights. And just to round that circle of goodwill off, even the military appears to be taking quite a cooperative approach. They're certainly not doing that out in the battlefield in Kachin State, but in Naypyidaw, in Parliament, they have actually played a fairly constructive role and have deferred from intervening in affairs outside of national security, which is, of course, their domain. Now, having said all of this, there is still very significant challenges, very significant risks. Moderates on all sides are facing potential rebellion from more hardline elements within their own groups, and with the 2015 elections likely to encourage a return to more confrontational politics, and also, I must say, patience growing a little bit thin among a lot of people who still don't feel that they have benefited from the reforms. With all of this, I think we would have to say that the potential for serious conflict, at least in the medium term, which could put the entire reform process at risk, should not be underestimated. Now, the challenges Myanmar faces in that respect are common to many transitional countries, and they center essentially around, in my view at least, the negotiation of three key socio-political relationships. And these are the relationships between the old and the new elite, between the Burman majority and the ethnic minorities, and between the state and society. And if I start by looking at the first, we have seen until now, as I said, a very conciliatory approach from the NLD, but the NLD is intent, it seems, to secure another landslide victory in 2015. And Aung San Suu Kyi, who has long sort of said, I'm not really that interested in power, well, she is now openly declaring that her goal is to take over the presidency in 2015. Now, this is very understandable. These are clearly very emotionally charged issues for the NLD, which has suffered 20 years of intense repression since it, in fact, won elections back in 1990. But I must say, at least looking from the outside, it is hard to see how these kinds of aspirations can be reconciled with the need in a plural society for power sharing, for nonpartisan politics, and not least the imperative of ensuring continued military support for the reform process. To ensure that these critical relationships between the old and the new elite do not break down leading into, as a result of the 2015 elections, some kind of agreement will need to be reached between the different sides that protect their core interests. At the moment, the 2008 Constitution serves that purpose. And despite its obvious flaws, its very obvious democratic shortcomings, leaving it in place, or at least leaving key clauses in place, may be the only way to ease the fears of the military or other vested interests of a future NLD-led government and preempt a backlash coup. The question, and I don't have an answer to this, is if the NLD accepts this conundrum, if it is prepared to share power in order to protect this incremental process of reform that we're now seeing. Because if it doesn't, I think we will have turbulent waters ahead. A second set of critical negotiations is taking place between the government and ethnic armed groups. Myanmar's long-standing civil war is the main reason why military rule has continued in Myanmar for as long as it has. And it is impossible to imagine democracy taking root in the country in the absence of peace. Now, the traction that the Thein Sein government has got on this issue is perhaps the most important achievement of all. But as with NLD, final success in this area will require addressing fundamental questions about power sharing, about resource sharing, about ethnic, language, and cultural rights. In this case, of course, not between the old and the new elite, but between the center and the periphery. So again, watch that space. There is certainly difficulties ahead. The final set of critical negotiations is taking place between the state in a more general sense and society. Now, these, of course, are more abstract. You can't imagine an explicit deal or a contract between the state and society, but there's no doubt that the government will need to deliver on popular expectations for material progress in order to maintain political stability. Thein Sein has made poverty alleviation, President Thein Sein, for those who don't know him, has made poverty alleviation a high priority. And judging from the kind of initiative, the kind of economic reforms that we've seen from the government so far, there's no need to doubt their intentions on this. However, economic change is, in many ways, perhaps even harder than political change. Weak state capacity means that many high-level initiatives are failing to make an impact on the ground. And in the freer political environment, there's been a fair bit of social unrest growing. This is common to, as you probably know, many of you, to democratic countries where people suddenly have a chance to speak out about their grievances. Now, speaking out about your grievances, of course, is to a great extent a healthy process. It's part of, it helps make sure that the people at the top actually know what the people elsewhere in the country think, what their needs are. But there's no doubt that any major unrest, especially in the main cities, could invite military intervention and threaten the entire reform process. Historically, these are the types of situations where the Myanmar military intervenes, and I have no doubt that they might do so again in the future. So, looming in the background of all of these issues is the military and the need to keep this, the most powerful institution in Myanmar politics, on the side of reform, and of course over time to begin to build civilian control of that military, but that'll be a long process. Failure to negotiate any of these three critical relationships that I've just talked about could all too easily produce the conditions for another military coup. And even if it doesn't go that far, failure would certainly seriously limit the ability of the government to effectively implement the kind of reforms that are needed to bring about peace, prosperity, and human rights. And Myanmar could all too easily get stuck in the same kind of quicksand of partial change that so many other new democracies seem to be stuck in. Now, the international community has a crucially important role to play in all of this, in helping ensure that it doesn't go that bad, that Myanmar are able to get through these challenges and move on. The most immediate responsibility for that, I think, probably rests on the shoulders of our governments, and it will require very deft, high-level diplomacy as well as probably a fair bit of generosity. But universities, NGOs, and other civil society groups also have much to contribute, not least in helping build the capacity of both the Myanmar state and Myanmar society to effectively implement reform. And I'm hoping that as we're all gathering here, that this inaugural conference of the Australia-Myanmar Institute can be at least the start of a conversation about how best to do that. I'm certainly looking forward both to hear from the later speakers, some of which I have known a long time, some of which are new to me, but also to engage, hopefully, with as many people as we can manage in 2 days in this room to discuss these things further. Thank you.